Okay, when we meet on Monday, we're going to finish our discussion of Shiloh by Bobby Ann Mason. Everyone did a really good job in the discussion board of taking apart some of the important characteristics of Leroy and Norma Jean. And I thought you did a really nice job of connecting some of the pieces together. We see that Bobby Ann Mason is giving us a lot of clues about her character in the way that she associates things and events with them. So we see that there's a kind of pattern with Leroy uh, in the craft kits that he keeps building, where he's just following directions, to his desire to build a log cabin, something that, uh, as we talked about, he kind of already knows how to do, right? Because we learned the basic construction techniques when we were playing with Lincoln Logs as a kid. And in fact, we see him playing with Lincoln Logs at one point in the story, I think. So we have those kinds of dynamics with him, all of which suggest not that he's a bad character, but just that he's a character who really doesn't want to grow. He, in some ways, lacks a kind of curiosity. We can see that in other aspects of his life as well. When he was a truck driver and he would retell the story of uh, when their child, their son Randy, died, he would get to the end of the story and he would always ask the hitchhiker that he had picked up, "So, what do you think?" I want you to see a connection there between his inability or unwillingness to do the hard work of trying to figure things out, trying to do interpretation, and Bottom, who we met in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Remember, Bottom's the rude mechanical who goes into the forest. He has an absolutely marvelous time as opposed to all the other people in the forest who are really having a terrible time of an experience of loss and horror. Bottom at the end of it doesn't want to do any interpretation. Remember, he wants Peter Quince to write the song about what his dream means. Bottom's very content to let other people do the interpretive work, and as a result, we see that he really doesn't ever change. Maybe we don't want him to, but he doesn't grow in the way that the other characters do. Those other characters have their dreams and they have to try to figure out what they mean. They have to make sense of their experience of loss and their experience of frustration and their experience of loneliness and grow from it and mature. Leroy, we see, doesn't really ever want to do that. He wants to leave that work for somebody else. And in fact, within the story, every time that he every time that he might learn something, uh, every time that he and Norma Jean come to a point when they can have a conversation where he might actually learn, he chooses instead to smoke marijuana. And I think we can see with that what he's doing is kind of shutting off his mind. He may be, as we discussed on the discussion board, he may be self-medicating. He may very well be a character who has some post-traumatic stress disorder from the horrific accident that he was in. But he chooses not to deal with anything. He just kind of tunes out. Uh, he wants look for other parts to this pattern, right? He always wants to listen to the same music, the music that he and Norma Jean listened to when they were young. He wants her to cook the same kind of foods that he's always enjoyed. Nothing wrong with any of that, but he we can see why he is growing away from Norma Jean, who seems to be really on this quite interesting trajectory of wanting to learn new things and experiment, and we can see that when she wants to cook different foods from different cultures. She wants to take these classes. She's physically building herself up with the bodybuilding class, which, as we talked about, even in itself has a number of implications in terms of gender roles. So as we finish the story, I want us to come back to Mabel, a character that we really haven't spoken very much about. Usually, of the three principal characters in the story, students like Mabel the least, and that's understandable. She's overbearing and she's she's definitely a pain uh, to her daughter. Uh, Leroy and Norma Jean are adults. They're in their mid-30s, and Mabel just walks into their house and gives them advice. Uh, so I want us to think about her as a character, and I also want to think about her desire for Norma Jean and Leroy to go to the Civil War battleground Shiloh, where of course they do go at the end of the story. Why is that trip so important to her? Uh, and when we get there, I want us to see if we can make sense of the one physical thing in the story that's most closely associated with Mabel, and that's the dust ruffle that she makes for their bed. It's actually mentioned twice. Remember, she brings it over, and Leroy says that they can hide things from her under it, which it seems odd. It's his house. He's a grown adult. Um, he may want to hide his marijuana from law enforcement if they come looking. Uh, why is he hiding it from his mother-in-law? They're old enough to make and own their own decisions. And then, of course, at the end of the story, the last image that we have is of that dust ruffle again. So I want you to try to make some sense of that. I also want us to look at a couple of other passages. One is the one right after Norma Jean gets up and leaves and announces to Leroy that she wants to end their marriage. We go into his mind. Um, we start experiencing some of his thoughts, and we find out that it's all well, and of course he's impaired by the drugs that he's been using, but he can't quite process that his wife is leaving him, and he's jumping back and forth between little fragments of the Civil War, and then he's imagining a raid that the local police department did on a bowling alley, and he's trying to figure out what Norma Jean's doing, and it's all kind of in this fog of the drug impairment. But he also says in that piece, and I think it's interesting that he's leaving the outsides, or I'm sorry, he's leaving the insides out of history. When we're on the discussion board, I want you to talk to me about what you think Bobby Ann Mason means when she says that he's leaving the insides out of history. And then finally, I want us to think about the very end as Norma Jean is going away. She's heading towards the bluffs, which would be like cliffs, and then she's heading towards the river. In crossing the river, uh, that's a pretty easy one in some ways to figure out. That is suggesting a baptism into a new life. It's suggesting a rebirth, a um, a death and rebirth experience through the water. The uh, the bluffs may represent the kind of the danger and perilousness of her journey. And in fact, we would know that maybe connecting her a little bit to Sammy, who we met in the beginning of the semester in A&P, she has made a big decision, and maybe you'll have to decide this. It's the right decision, but boy, her life's not going to be easy. There's going to be a lot of loneliness, and we can imagine that she is really cutting a lot of ties that have and relationships that maybe have held her back, like her relationship with Leroy and her relationship with her mother, but also that have served as her support mechanism and have helped sustain her. So I want to talk about those things as we finish up the Bobby Ann Mason story. And then we will move into a really difficult poem, and I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about it. We probably won't get any further than this poem next week, so we'll do the best we can. Uh, John Donne's A Valediction Forbidding Mourning is a beautiful poem, but it's a complex poem, and we'll have to take it apart really line by line. Donne is part of a school of poetry that we call the metaphysical poets. And they were a group of poets. They weren't really all connected with each other. It's not like they were all hanging out saying, "Hey, let's be metaphysical poets." In fact, they didn't call themselves that at all. They weren't that name didn't come up until about a century later when a critic and writer, actually the author of our first real dictionary, Samuel Johnson, coined them as the metaphysical poets. What Johnson meant is that they were poets who were moving away from the kind of simple beauty that we might find in, say, the Elizabethan sonnets that we read of William Shakespeare. And if we think about some of those sonnets and we look at the metaphors in them, uh, they kind of make sense, right? I mean, in one of his sonnets, Shakespeare talks about growing older, and he compares growing older to a tree in the wintertime. And yellow leaves are few or none do hang on that tree. Well, that makes sense for especially for a man growing older, as the hair starts to change color, sometimes going to a kind of straw color before it turns white or gray, and then of course hair falling out, which happens to a lot of men as they get older. And elsewhere in the poem, Shakespeare will compare getting older to a fire that where the flame has gone out and just the embers are glowing. And again, we can think of all the different ways, and he does, that the aging process is like a dying fire. He compares growing older to a sunset. Again, it kind of makes sense. The metaphysical poets, in contrast, are always going to give us these intellectually challenging and really unexpected metaphors. And they'll often be metaphors that function at a lot of different levels. There are a lot of different meanings that we can tease out of them. Those kinds of metaphors are called conceits, uh, spelled the same way as we would like somebody who's conceited. A conceit is an elaborate metaphor, a metaphysical conceit. And boy, does John Donne give us a bunch of them in this poem. One really famous one towards the end are going to be really intellectually complicated poems, and the conceits are going to work at a lot of different levels, and they're not going to make a whole lot of sense right away. So this poem is, although it doesn't seem like it when we're reading it, this is a love poem. Uh, we don't really know exactly when or why it was written. One of Donne's early biographers tells a story, and I think it's a nice way of framing the poem, and it may be true. The story that Isaac Walton tells is that Donne was going on a journey. He was traveling from England to France, which was a journey filled with some danger at this time, and they never really knew how long these things would take. And he was going to be gone for some time. Before he left, his wife had a horrific dream that tragedy would befall during this journey, and she was worried about him going on this journey. And Walton tells us that this was a poem that Donne wrote to comfort his wife during the time that he was away. And we'll see as we're going through the poem that all of these elaborate metaphors are suggesting that their love, uh, which is he wants us to understand is a very profound love and a love that resides within the soul, is not really subject to any kind of danger that might befall their physical selves. So if you keep in mind that thematically this poem is going to be like that Shakespeare sonnet that we read, Sonnet 116. Remember, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remember. And remember, we looked at all the metaphors and we had that microcosm, macrocosm relationship of the earth and the stars, and their love resided in the level of the stars where things were eternal and perfect, and only their physical bodies were subject to time and decay and change on earth. John Donne's going to be playing with a lot of those, exactly those same ideas, but he's going to be doing it in a way that's a lot more challenging for us intellectually, and he's going to be doing it through metaphors that really just seem like they don't all fit together at first, and that they don't belong in a love poem. Part of the joy that we have in reading metaphysical poetry is in figuring it out. The poems become almost like puzzles that we have to try to sort the meaning of and think, what does this part have to do with this part? How do we connect them? That's the challenge. So uh, I'm going to talk just briefly about the first two stanzas, and I'll kind of walk you through them, and then we'll see what we can do as you're going on uh, to the additional stanzas when we're discussing this on Blackboard. Okay. Uh, as virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say, the breath goes now, and some say no. Okay. So as we're looking at that first stanza, right away we can see what in the heck kind of love poem is this? The scene that we have is a deathbed scene. The person who's dying, as virtuous men, and the idea that of him being virtuous is actually going to be very important. As virtuous men pass mildly away, one of the ideas that's embedded in this is that this person is dying so gently, transitioning from the experience of living to being dead, that it's the change is almost imperceptible. A couple lines later, we find out his sad friends do say the breath goes now, and some say no. And you've heard the stories they used to before they had all the equipment that we have now. They would sometimes hold a mirror underneath someone's nostrils to see if there was still breath with somebody who was just barely alive. That's how this guy is transitioning almost imperceptibly from life to death, passing mildly away, and he also seems to be accepting what's coming. He's whispering to his soul to go. I want you, as you're thinking about this and creating the image, and if we were in class, I would draw a picture on the board. It would be as clumsy and silly and as bad as all of my other drawings. It would have little stick figures. It would have one dying guy on the bed, and I would ask you to think about his angle of vision. And if he's on the bed lying on his back, his angle of vision is going to be upwards towards the stars, towards the sun, within a Christian framework, and John Donne was an Anglican minister, so there's a Christian framework here. It would be towards the heavens. But he's not looking directly towards the sky. He's looking at it with his friends, the people who love him, serving right in the middle of where he is, right in the middle of his vision. He's seeing that image of the eternal, of the timeless, almost as it's mediated by the look of the people who are staring at him. Their vision, and notice that they don't have the contentment that he has. He seems to accept what is happening to him, while some of his sad friends do say their view is down towards him, not towards his soul, but towards his physical body. They're looking, think of that microcosm, macrocosm that we talked about in Shakespeare. He is whispering to his soul, the eternal part of himself, to go to heaven. He is staring upwards towards the heaven. They are examining his physical body, his material self. They're looking downward towards the earth. His is an experience of acceptance and understanding. Theirs is an experience of sadness. He has a certainty of perhaps where his soul will go. They're not only sad, but also in a state of confusion. While some of his sad friends do say the breath goes now and some say no. That difference of the angle of vision, upwards towards the heaven or downwards towards the earth, towards the physical, is really important. So is the fact that his loved ones, his friends, are between him and the heaven. He is not seeing the heaven unfiltered, if you will, but he's seeing it in the context of the people who are about him. When we get to the very end of this poem, one of the things that we're going to find, and you'll see it once you're looking for it if you haven't already, is the last metaphor becomes at the end a really dirty joke. Uh, we'll You'll find it, and we'll point it out. What I'm going to suggest to you is that this is not, when we get to the end of it, John Donne just saying, I told you this whole story about love resides in the soul and it's eternal and all the rest of it. But then look at the end. He's writing it to his wife. Look at the end. I made the whole thing into a dirty sex joke. It's not that. There's something real. Remember, the metaphysical poets are always going to be trying to show us connections with things that are really hard to understand. In some ways, Donne in this poem is trying to show us the qualities of human love that perhaps exceed our ability to put them in words. There's a connection. I'm going to ask you to try to find it between those friends that he's seeing and the dirty joke. That's nothing dirty's going on with the friends, but it has to do with physicality and their bodies. But we'll see how we can put that together. Now let's move on to the second stanza quickly. Um, Goodness, I've forgotten it now. How could I do that? So let us melt and make no noise, no tear floods nor sigh tempests move, 'twere profanation of our joys, to tell the laity our love. So he's saying in the first stanza, as he's introducing a simile. And now in the second stanza, he's saying, just as virtuous men die peacefully and mildly and with acceptance, so too let us experience our physical separation from each other. So let us part. And then he's saying, nothing overblown, not like those sappy, not Shakespeare, but the other sonneteers from the Elizabethan age, the lovesick ones. And oh, if they were going to be separated from each other, they would cry, but they'd be so upset that they'd cry a river, or he said a flood here, and they'd sigh because they were going to be so lonely without the person that they loved, but they'd sigh a tempest, a whole storm. And he's saying, no, none of that. No tear floods nor sigh tempests move. And then, toward profanation of our joys, to tell the laity our love. The word profane, which we use uh, to mean vulgar language, or he's using profanity, he's using language that's inappropriate, curse words and things. Actually, the original meaning means something closer to outside the sacred or outside the temple. There is the sacred and there's the profane. The opposite of profane is not polite, it's sacred. There's the sacred space within the church, and there's the profane space outside of the church. Laity here, uh, and some of you, if you attended a a church school when you were growing up, you might have had teachers who were part of the clergy, and then you had lay teachers. They were teachers who were not part of the clergy. So both profanation and laity have the idea of being outside of the outside of the sacred or outside of the ordained. What he seems to be saying is that their love um, is sacred. It's within it's within the sacred space, like the church. So they don't have to cry and sigh and carry on the way that people whose love was entirely physical. And now I'll end on this point just to show you the kind of richness that Donne creates in his poems. If you visit, and someday we shall all be able to visit them again when all of this is over. If you visit Europe, and while you're there, you travel through some of the magnificent old cathedrals, which you should do just to see the architecture and the magnificence of them. One of the things that you will no doubt notice is the beautiful stained glass. Many of those cathedrals will have a gorgeous circular window over where the light reflects down on the altar of the church. And often the depictions on that window will be of the eternal in Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Magnificent cathedral that was not in any way damaged by the fire that has damaged Notre Dame. The circular window over the altar depicts the book of Revelation. When you are inside the church, looking upwards towards that window, so you're in the sacred space, looking upwards towards that window, towards the heavens, the sunlight coming in is transformed by the glass and shows you a picture of the eternal. When you are on the outside of that same cathedral, and this is true for it's true for Notre Dame, it's true for many of them, you're in the profane space. You're out in the world where things are determined by time and everything changes. The stone lattice work that you can't really see from the inside depicts the wheel of fortune, the the chance, uh, the uncertainty that controls our earthly lives. Inside, looking up towards the heavens, but notice it's through something physical. It's through the glass. You see the reassuring vision of the eternal. Hold that idea in mind, because that's actually connected to the image of that dying man thinking of his soul in the sacred space. He's the friends are looking down, they're the ones in the profane space. He is in the sacred space. looking up, but he's not looking straight towards the sun. He's looking to the heavens as seen through his friends. That's going to be important when we get to the end of the film. Okay, I've talked too much. We will pick all this up tomorrow. Um, Sorry to make you to listen to so much of me before we meet on Monday. Take care, everyone.